the upcoming summit as the host of the event. You can see his remarks Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern and Pacific here on C-SPAN.
This week's Close-Up program is about the challenges facing Islam. Close-Up Foundation host John Milewski moderates this one-hour discussion.
Hello and welcome to the Museum in Arlington, Virginia for this week's Close-Up at the Museum discussion. Hi, I'm John Milewski of the Close-Up Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about two new and important books with the authors, and we'll be discussing this subject matter with students from Langley High School in Langley, Virginia. Also other guests who've been invited to join us for the discussion. You'll meet them when they ask their questions and make their comments. Now I want to introduce you to our guests. Joining us today is Akbar Ahmed. Akbar is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies and Professor of International Relations at American University. Prior to his academic career, he served as a diplomat. He was Pakistan's ambassador to the United Kingdom, among other things. And among his many works is this, his latest book. It's called Islam Under Siege. We'll talk about this book during the course of our hour. Also joining us, Joyce Davis. Joyce is the Deputy Foreign Editor for Knight Ridder Newspapers. Previously, she served as Foreign Editor and Special Projects Reporter for National Public Radio, where she was the Middle East Affairs correspondent. Her new book is called Martyrs, Innocence, Vengeance, and Despair in the Middle East. Very heavy subject matter that we'll be discussing today. Welcome to the discussion. Akbar, if we could begin with you and the title itself and the imagery on the cover, Islam Under Siege. I think when I first met you, you were resisting the notion of a war between cultures or a clash of civilizations. The new title might suggest a change in your thinking.
Not entirely, John. The sense of siege is, of course, in this book focused on Islam, Muslim societies, where Muslim societies look at the Palestinians or the Kashmiris or the Chechens or the Bosnians and the attacks on the Prophet, the attacks on Islam, and do feel that there's a sense of siege. But there's also another phenomenon. If you notice, after September, the American media were broadcasting news here in America under the title America Under Siege. In Israel, Israelis feel under siege surrounded by the Arabs. The Indians feel under siege surrounded by Pakistan and Bangladesh, Muslim countries. So we are living in times where people and groups are feeling under siege. And that is why sometimes when they see acts of violence in the name of their religion or culture, they feel that there is no honor left, because these acts of violence are aimed at innocent civilians, innocent women and children, and therefore this notion of living in a post-honor world.
Now, you've selected this imagery carefully. This is not just a random publicity shot of any kind. Let me show it to the camera, and if you could explain to us what the imagery suggests.
This is a very powerful illustration of the title, the Islam Under Siege title, and selected incidentally by the Polity Press, which is a very well-known academic press at Cambridge University in England. It's a man calling the Muslim prayer, call to prayer, the azan. Behind him is a minaret from the mosque which has been blown up, and behind are the colors, yellow and red, and the colors suggesting the world in flames, a world under siege. It's a very powerful image for Muslims, and really this book is in a sense a request, a plea to pull back from the brink, pull back from the precipice. So therefore it's an analysis of what's happening and what I believe we should be doing to try to bring peoples and groups together in terms of some kind of dialogue or understanding.
This notion of a clash of civilizations that have been promoted by others, what are they missing? Because you see it differently, you see more gray. What are those people missing?
I see it very differently. For instance, the clash of civilizations as propagated or propounded by Professor Huntington, Professor Bernard Lewis and so on, do tend to simplify issues. They see simply the West in confrontation with the Muslim world. But just take us, the Muslim populations living in the West. Now surely these are bridges between the West and the world of Islam. These are ambassadors, if you like, between these two cultures. Now they're not taken into account normally in these analyses. Then the great men and women who have been advocating dialogue. Now the last 2 days I was up in a retreat where the Bishop John Chain and the senior Rabbi Bruce Lustig organized an interfaith dialogue for something like 200 clergy. Now, it's very, very inspiring dialogue, and that is where the dialogue is taking place. Now, you won't suspect that this is happening if you just listen to the news, if you just heard this loud drumbeat of clash, clash, clash. So we need to be aware that there is dialogue and we need to be able to promote it.
Is the dialogue, the type of dialogue that you just participated in and talk about, is that happening beyond the borders of the U.S.?
It's not happening as much as I'd like it to happen. It's starting here. Remember, this is very, very new. These are the first tiny steps, and therefore we must encourage it, and we must congratulate people like the bishop and the rabbi, because these are bold moves within the community. This is something that's fairly new. It has happened, but not on this scale. And I'm sure that this is going to pick up momentum. And once it picks up momentum and people see it, and the media pick it up, and unfortunately, John, I mentioned this in my book, the media only pick up things that are negative. They like clash. So they like things which make news on television in the evening, on the news. They don't like what to them are bland talks and conversations and dialogue. But those dialogues are as revolutionary as talk of clashes.
Mm-hmm. You introduced the concept of honor, and in the book you talk in terms of a post-honor world. Could you expand on that thought?
Yes, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm looking at the world, the 21st century, and societies living in it through the lens of anthropology. And the notion of honor, the notion of dignity, the notion of how societies relate to themselves and their own sense of identity is now under challenge. So again, whether they're Muslims, whether they are Hindus, they look around and they see their traditional institutions under pressure. And this is because of the process of globalization. It's not necessarily because of the other, the ethnic other or the religious other. They see the processes of globalization threatening their traditional way of life. And they feel that traditional honor, traditional dignity is under challenge. And therefore, once again, we may be living in a post-honor world, particularly when you translate honor or use it in a distorted, perverted way to commit dishonorable acts, raping women, killing the innocent, killing civilians, and considering that an honorable act. Now, those are dishonorable acts, and they are only explainable or explicable if you understand the frame within which they are done. That is a post-honor world.
Joyce, I think it's important to point out that your interest as a reporter in this subject matter is not some reaction to 9/11, some exploitive jump on the bandwagon. This was a book you were working on prior to the 9/11 attacks. Yeah. What was the story that you were on to then that the rest of the world has caught up to since September 11, 2001?
Well, we were looking clearly at what was going on between the Israelis and Palestinians. Initially, I wanted to look at an explanation of that and why that had the potential to be a threat to Americans and to the United States. And to just take a look at what many people were saying was a distortion of the principles of Islam to justify such acts.
Mm-hmm. And explain to us the concept of martyrdom as your reporting unfolded it for you in the world of Islam.
Well, martyrdom, frankly, is a concept that's revered by peoples all over the world, by all religions. In the United States, we just finished memorializing those soldiers who died in defense of their country. So we honor, everyone honors martyrs, and Islam is no different. But in Islam, I think there is a special reference, and it may be because so many people, so many Muslims do feel, as Dr. Ahmed just said, under siege. They do feel that these are extraordinary times, and many do feel that their religion basically is at war with the United States.
Then give us your reaction to this characterization of a clash of civilizations that has been promoted. We've heard Akbar's take on that. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'll tell you, I think he's absolutely right there. It's a complex issue. There's so many gray areas. You can't say that one civilization is at war with another civilization because there are so many people, so many moderates within these civilizations who are about dialogue. And yes, this dialogue is going on throughout the world. But the fact is, I do believe the United States is now engaged in a world war. This is a war that is that we are basically facing with many Islamic militants around the globe. And we need the moderate Muslims, we need people of ration and of logic to basically help us fight this war.
So the distinction you're making is it's a world war with Islamic radicals.
With radicals, that's right.
Tell us about the interviews you conducted in the book. What were some of the more surprising things that you uncovered?
Well, one of the surprising things I uncovered was even in the midst of the most desperate situations, there are people who hold on to their sound values, who hold on to their religious principles. And I went to visit, in particular, the mother of a young man who was a suicide bomber. And you would have expected that this woman would be declaring her son a martyr, that she would be saying, as many of her neighbors said, that he died in the noble defense of Islam. But I stood in this woman's living room, And I talked to her, and I felt the grief in her heart when she told me that no, her son did not achieve martyrdom, that she could not condone that kind of martyrdom, that if she could have, she would have prevented it. She would have bolted every door and locked every window. But on the other hand, I did go and talk to so many people, including trainers of suicide bombers, who have a long waiting list of people who are prepared to do such acts.
What is the catalyst or the influence that leads to this? Is it tied to a religious belief or a perverted religious belief, as you might describe it, or is it more political?
Religion plays a factor in that many of the people who choose this path go inward. They look for some sort of justification, some sort of higher justification. And in that, frankly, there are the scholars, Islamic scholars say that, most of them say that they are simply distorting the precepts of Islam. And this distortion comes about from the anger and the environment, the desperate environment in which they are living. The fact that they have, especially with the young people, you look around in the refugee camps in the West Bank or even in Lebanon, and the only role models young people have are people running around with guns. This is all they know. They have no way out of war, and so they are desperate.
One of the interesting comparisons you make in the book is another group of desperate people who were living without honor, African-American slaves in this country, and that the path there was a non-violent path. What are the differences that you can point to, and why one group of people feeling oppressed, not feeling oppressed, actually oppressed, and another group of people feeling oppressed and in some countries actually oppressed?
This was a question that really is at the root of my research into this. I started the book off in a service with in the Church of the Reverend Kenny Smith in Vienna, Virginia. I'm a Baptist. And we were celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and the nonviolent civil rights movement. And I couldn't help but notice that, yes, African Americans endured centuries of slavery, humiliation of the worst kind, including my own personal experiences in the South, growing up in New Orleans. And yet we had at least the majority, again, the majority, opted for a path of nonviolence, a path of civil disobedience, but that is not to say that in this movement there wasn't the threat from some groups of violence. We will recall the riots, we will recall all of the Black Panthers and all of this, but the majority chose another path. But I do believe that there are some differences. The difference is that there were laws that could be used here. There were ways, there was an alternative to violence. And in many cases, people believe in the region that we're looking at that there is no alternative. And that may be the single biggest difference.
But even in a time of where the laws didn't apply, the Civil War, it wasn't slaves leading a revolt and causing a war.
Well, in some cases it was. I mean, in some cases there were examples of slaves who did try to overthrow, and there were whites who tried, as I mentioned in the book, who tried to lead slaves into rebellion. But it did not get anywhere, and it was futile, and by and large that was not the path taken.
Akbar, you know that there are people out there who look at Islam and Muslims with suspicion and are concerned that this is a religion that promotes violence. And in trying to figure out this question that we've been discussing with Joyce, what are your insights that you could provide to those people? What should they be looking for to figure this out?
I think, John, the first step they have to take is to really try to understand Islam, to read more about it in an objective way, in a neutral way. You may have seen the the major article in the New York Times 2 days ago, in which the article quoted certain priests, certain evangelists who have launched what seems to be an attack on Islam, on the Prophet, on the Quran, and so on. And the secret of their strategy apparently is based on the chocolate chip cookie, because apparently Muslims like chocolate chip cookies, and if you give them this, they will convert. This is the strategy. They'll convert and become good Christians. Now, I was appalled at this because someone must have given them this expert bit of advice. It was a similar advice given to American troops when they landed in Iraq, if you remember. They were told that the local people in Basra will garland them, will throw roses and petals at them and welcome them. In fact, that didn't quite happen that way. So obviously they need to understand what they're dealing with, who they're dealing with. These are societies in Africa and Asia which are traditional, which keep the memory of history alive. They keep their customs, their rituals, their traditions alive. And above all, they honor the notion of honor, the notion of dignity. This is very important. They may be poor. We must not condemn them or dismiss them simply because we look at them and say this person earns $5 a month and lives in a little shack, because they have a lot of dignity, the dignity of history, the dignity of their own culture and their own customs. So this sense of respect must come from some understanding of the cultures they're dealing with. And then if they're able to engage in dialogue in terms of the message of Christianity, which is a great message because Jesus is as much prized and valued and revered in Islam as in Christianity, the Muslim world would welcome that dialogue. But that is not happening. The face, and Joyce is absolutely right that you have the African-American experience here, which is an internal struggle. But over there, outside, in the Muslim world, it's very much a Muslim struggle. So therefore, how you deal with the Muslims becomes absolutely critical.
Post 9/11 American mantra, why do they hate us? And I guess initially we were talking about terrorists. Now that may have been expanded to include the French and others. But both of you address this in your book. You take a stab at answering the question, why they hate us. Can we ask you to do that now? What are the main areas of grievance against the United States?
Well, I particularly look at the militants, the Islamic militants in this book, to research and to lay out what it is that they see as their grievance. Because we need to know. We need to know. We don't necessarily need to accept it, but we need to at least know what it is that their grievance. I have narrowed it down just to try to simplify it as much as I can for Americans to 3 main points. One point, of course, is the Israeli-Palestinian problem. There is the perception that the United States is biased toward Israel to the detriment of the Palestinians. That is a grievance that is overwhelmingly expressed when I have gone to talk to these folks. The second issue that is on the table is the presence of American troops in areas that Muslims consider holy, in the areas of Mecca and Medina and Saudi Arabia. The Bush administration has taken steps to deal with that issue by announcing a withdrawal of some of the American forces. But the third issue, and the one that I really think is paramount, is the accusation that the United States supports despotic regimes, monarchies, and that it actually works against the kinds of evolutions and revolutions that would bring about more representative governments. Those are the 3, but by far, at least as I see it, this issue of are we really promoting the best interests of the people of the region, or are we promoting our own business, financial, or other interests, which is really hurting the people of the region.
Akbar, would you add anything to number 4 to Joyce's list?
Joyce has summed it up very well. I would simply point out that there is a perspective, and we need to be conscious of this, in the Muslim world, where the Muslim world does, not all of them, not even the majority, but a lot of them do look up to the United States of America. There is a great deal of affection for the United States, and therefore a great deal of expectations that this is the great homeland of democracy, of human rights, of liberties. There are millions of Muslims living here who migrated recently, and they would like, the Muslim world would like America to provide them that kind of moral lead. And that somehow is being frustrated. They're feeling let down, and I think that also feeds into the sense of anti-Americanism which you see around the world today.
Joyce's list, the Israeli-Palestinian debate, we now have the Bush roadmap, the despots, or supportive despots, the overthrow of one of the world's leading despots in Saddam Hussein. Do these help or hurt, these U.S. actions?
Again, it depends on when and how. To counter this, if you talk to a Muslim, he will immediately say, well, who set him up in the first place? And they're going to remind you that it was the CIA and Donald Rumsfeld was visiting Saddam in the 80s and so on. So if we are clear, Joyce is absolutely right. If America is to take the moral high ground, which it symbolizes, and that is what the significance of America in the 21st century, and is clear about not supporting despots, it will help America in its relationship with the Muslim peoples. Because from Morocco to Indonesia, the average, the man in the street, if you like, is frustrated, and he sees his miseries on account of his ruler, his local ruler. And behind the local ruler, he does see the superpower. And that is what causes the frustration. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the point that Dr. Ahmed raised is really worthy of us understanding. Even many of the militants I have spoken to have no grievance against the American system, against democracy. They may decide that they want a democracy that would have an Islamic flavor. Some of the more hardline ones, let's be frank, want a strict Islamic state. But many of the people, including many of the militants, would be willing to allow elections to let the people decide what they want. And this is where we're having problems in Iraq, because if we allow the people to vote and decide, they very well may choose an Islamic
We want
government.
them to select from a list of our choosing.
That seems to be the problem.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi, my name is Saeed Khan from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in Michigan. My question is actually for the both of you. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there seems to be this phenomenon occurring across the world where there's a merger of religious and political rhetoric, not so much necessarily among religious leaders, but among political leaders. And it's occurring in democracies from India to Israel, at the time Serbia, and since January 2001, it has started to occur in the United States. I was wondering if you could comment as to why you feel there is this trend of this merger of, if you will, church and state, at least in the rhetoric of the political leaders.
Saeed, your January 2001 reference is obvious to the swearing in of George W. Bush as president.
That's correct.
Yeah, and what give us a more explicit observation on Mr. Bush and what you're seeing as far as his use of religion in his rhetoric.
Well, I think that even prior to September of 2001, there were a lot of initiatives that were being proposed by the Bush administration, i.e. faith-based initiatives, the suspension of funding to certain programs that seem to be unpalatable to those who have particular religious persuasions. So it is something that I feel has been documented, has preceded the lead up to 9/11.
Do you see this melding of political and religious rhetoric as a good thing or a bad thing?
I find it to be a very troubling thing, particularly in democracies. I mean, it is something that, for example, in post-conflict Iraq is not going to be tolerated, again, according to the rhetoric of the administration, as to a theocratic regime or one in which even, for example, a Pledge of Allegiance in Iraq may be having the words "under God" imbibed into it, whereas in the United States it seems as though, according to recent court cases, there's certainly a build-up to making sure that it is firmly cemented in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay, reactions?
I, in fact, talk about this, John, because we are living in the 21st century in a world where, a post-honor world, where the state becomes party. Very often a party to suppressing its own minority groups. And if the state becomes a religious state, then the minority, not belonging to the majority religion, is going to have a lot of trouble. And you can see the Balkans, you can see the Middle East, you can see South Asia, for examples. India, for instance, is now ruled by a religious party, and they want to make India a religious state. Now, there are millions and millions of Indians who are not happy with this trend. The Taliban wanted Afghanistan to be a religious state. The Middle East, you have many examples. So I agree that the trend is a dangerous one.
I guess my take on this is a little bit different. In this country, we revere a separation of those things because of the history of conflict that it has caused to mix religion with politics. But in my dealings with people around the world, many people believe that the proper place for religious principles is in running a society and in running a government, that that's where those principles are needed most. So this idea of separating your beliefs, your religion, what guides you, your closeness to God, is not something that can be compartmentalized. It is a part of everything that you do. This has been told to me time and time again by Muslims, but I would suggest to you that this is also true for many Christians. And there is the danger of the intolerance of hardline religion creeping in and discriminating and oppressing people. But the fact is, many people, including many Christians, want those principles as a part of their daily lives.
But again, Joyce, it depends on how you interpret religion. Because if you interpret it to mean compassion and tolerance and understanding, then it's a good thing.
Absolutely.
But if you interpret it to mean the subjugation or the humiliation of minority groups who don't belong to your group, then you are in trouble in a democracy.
That's absolutely right. I have no, but yet, at least the enlightened people that I speak to in all religions, including Islam, do not interpret and do not see it that way. They see it as a tolerant religion.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks.
Good morning. My name is Ty Miller from Langley High School. My question draws away a little bit from the idea of establishment and separation of church and state. Earlier in the discussion, the professor mentioned the suspicion between the Islamic peoples and the other states as well as here in America. You said that it's very difficult to open up a dialogue when people are this suspicious. Thus, what would your recommendations be to the Bush administrations of how to open up this dialogue between the Muslim society in America, the non-Muslim society in America, and even those Islamic nations outside of our own country?
And you might add, when you answer the question about your own experience in talking to Mr. Bush.
Yes, that's a very good question, because it's a practical question, an important question. One step forward, as I had mentioned earlier, was this interfaith dialogue. So the administration supports it, becomes involved in it, and is not indifferent to it. At this moment, it's happening, but it's happening because of 2 or 3 remarkable people involved in it. Secondly, in terms of understanding, President Bush took the initiative, and he must be acknowledged for this, going to the Islamic centers, calling Muslim leaders, talking to them, and that was very widely reported in the Muslim world and very much appreciated. And that those are acts that he needs to be doing, simply because the Muslim community in the United States of America, about 7 million in number, are American. They're loyal, pro-American, American citizens. And that community has to be, in a sense, brought into the loop, and then, in a sense, used, I don't like the word used, but used to act as a bridge with the rest of the Muslim world. Now, by and large, that community today feels alienated, marginalized. Some feel very paranoid. There's a big story in the New York Times about precisely this feeling in the Pakistani community in New York. Now, these are Americans. So what are we doing by alienating what potentially is a very strong ally into a neutral, uncertain, unsure community, frightened, talking about concentration camps, talking about registration, talking about all kinds of fears? Because what this is doing is generating a sense of global fear, which feeds into the larger fear that Joyce talked about.
And just to emphasize one of those points, I mean, we are not, Americans are not helping ourselves by not learning to discriminate between bad people and good people. And there are many good Muslims, and we need that community as a first defense, a first line of defense in this war on terrorism that we are definitely engaged in.
I mean, this, I'm risking sounding overly simplistic here, but can we quantify this notion? In other words, Hosni Mubarak said attacking Iraq would create 100 new bin Ladens. When you say that there are many good Muslims, I'm assuming you're saying that the majority of people are not the types of folks who hop on airplanes and fly them into skyscrapers.
We should hope so, because there are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. So.
Well, that's it. Is there any way to, how much do we know about those 1.2 billion people as far as quantifying? How many people would fall into this category that you both seem to agree is the problem, the radicals? I
would say, John, speaking as a Muslim, that the vast majority, and I'm saying this with great confidence, I'm a scholar writing about Islam, I've been an administrator administering large Muslim populations, the vast majority are what you call moderate. They want to get on with their lives. There are many things happening within Muslim society which I point out in my book. There are all kinds of pressures and problems within society. Gap between the rich and the poor, the illiteracy rates, the pressures of urbanization, the migration, all this is acting as a pressure to almost disintegrate society. So the last thing they're bothered about is what's happening in the United States of America. So what we need to be able to do is to identify that the vast majority would like to get on with their lives, and to then formulate our strategy, not, as Joyce says, to paint the entire Muslim world with this broad brush.
Is this small minority that is dangerous, is it a growing population?
It is growing. You're absolutely right, because I hear the commentary in the news and they talk about Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda, we were told, were a small group in Afghanistan in some caves. So how are they now a global force? They're in Morocco one day, they're in Riyadh the next day. It's amazing. That is because there's no such thing as Al-Qaeda except perhaps an idea or a group years ago, and now it's spread far and wide. The greater the frustration that Joyce talks about, the greater the support this movement will have. Now, to counter this, John, we need to be able to understand the phenomena, then to take certain steps. Otherwise, this is going to grow and grow and grow, and that small minority is going to drag in large swaths of the Muslim world into the confrontation.
You're agreeing with Hosni Mubarak.
Absolutely, I agree with Hosni Mubarak.
Well, just sure. On that point, too, I mean, the one thing we have to be concerned about is you can perhaps deal with the militants, the real people who would be out there and fly planes. But my concern, as I express in the book, is that there is a growing hostility of average people toward the United States. This creates an atmosphere that allows this kind of militancy to grow and to threaten us.
And it's a two-way process, John. I mean, I have a name, Ahmed. Now, if I go to the counter at an airport, the moment the person looks at the name Ahmed, in that person's mind there is suicide bombers. So whatever my background, and you were very kind to introduce me with such warmth and affection, whatever my background, for that person I am suspect. It's like the African American a decade ago or 2 decades ago. Anyone driving a car who belonged to this particular group would be held up or
Have you found yourself subject to random searches?
Well, I must confess, this may not be a good confession to make, but no. I mean, people have been very tolerant and very understanding, but I know a lot of my friends who have had a very rough time, and they feel, this is the important point, they feel it was only because they were Muslim or had a Muslim name. Now, it's happening too often. You see, once, twice, it has really happened to me. So I'm not therefore making a statement on this behalf. But what that does is, John, that feeds into the sense of being under siege. So the American, this is an American, feels that just because of my Muslimness, like the African American felt a generation ago, I am being singled out. And therefore, America is in the process of losing yet another friend. That is the point.
And Joyce, this is obviously familiar territory to you. You made references to your past.
Well, he keeps saying a generation ago, I would say that the issues are have not gone away yet for African Americans now.
Yeah. Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Charmaine Noor from Langley High School. I was just wondering, what do you think the role of American Muslims should be? And do you think perhaps that President Bush should appoint some American Muslims in, places such as Iraq or Afghanistan, where they would be like a perfect mix?
I think that's a very good question. I think the American Muslim has an important role to play. America is going through a great crisis. It's a national crisis. It's an international crisis. And America needs all the support, encouragement, and help that it can get. And the American Muslim is the ideal person to help America. So the youngsters of your generation must come forward, help here and help abroad, because American Muslims have got fantastic contacts in the Middle East, in South Asia and Central Asia. They should be spending the summer there. They've got all these wonderful programs helping reconstruct countries and showing the people there that America is not on a war path against Islam, that they are good, caring Americans, and that what they're hearing, because they're getting the other side of this clash of civilizations concept, that what they're hearing is not correct. That in fact is propagated only by certain people who may want a clash of civilizations from the Muslim world. So therefore you have to play that role.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Nassim Rubin. I am an Indian Jew and I am an AGC fellow, American Jewish Committee fellow on intergroup relations in South Asia and the United States. And I'm also a student of Dr. Ahmed at the School of International Service at American University. I just wanted to point out that the intergroup relations that we are talking about, we can look at South Asia as an example, where in India, in Bombay and Calcutta and Cochin, Ahmedabad and Karachi, we have all our Jewish synagogues in Muslim areas living amicably for centuries. So that could be a good example for people to look at and draw.
What do you think is the key thing, the key element that makes that possible?
The religious similarity. There's no religion closer to Judaism than Islam in terms of, we say salam alaikum, shalom aleichem, aleichem shalom, alaikum salam. And lots of the prophets are common, believed by both religions. And you'll be surprised to know that when South Asian Muslims fly across the Atlantic, they ask for kosher food. And same way we do for halal food in India. So I think we should draw a lot on our similarities rather than the differences. And the second is that in the Middle East and in South Asia, as ma'am rightly pointed out, it is poverty and ignorance that fuels hatred. I would not put everything on religion. Only when we address these issues, when the countries address these issues, can we move forward.
I don't think you have to limit that observation geographically.
This is a fascinating comment Nassim made, John, when I first met him a few months ago. Here was a Jewish person, but from India. And the kind of confrontation which unfortunately takes place between Jews and Muslims in the West is something he's unfamiliar with. And we talked and I was fascinated by what he told me. He said, our synagogues, our places of worship are in the heart of the Muslim areas because we feel most comfortable there. So there are examples, positive examples, that we need to be once again giving the media, and the media needs to pick this up. But again, the media seems indifferent to anything that I feel is positive or good or something that suggests strong interfaith dialogue, like Naseem is pointing out from India.
Well, let's since you've brought up the media's coverage a couple times, let's take a moment to discuss that. And we'll get both of your observations. There is this, in the 24-hour news cycle, media world that we live in here in the U.S., there is this aspect of sort of instant expert created, because the talking heads who are on TV every day are on TV every day, no matter what the story is.
Yeah.
How are the talking heads doing in talking about the world as it is right now?
Well, you know, I always feel a little tense when Dr. Ahmed starts talking about this, but you know, as I do soul searching, the truth is we do, as in the media, want the more sensational story. We want the thing, where's the conflict? And we don't frequently spend enough time looking at the dialogue. Dialogue is boring sometimes, you know, you say, but we need to find a way to bring these important issues to the American people. Now, sometimes the columnists are able to do this, but the problem is, in a newspaper, there's limited space. So the stories that are seen as the more threatening or the more sensational will get the play. On television, it's the same, a limited number of minutes. And so the story is considered to be breaking now, or we'll get the play, and to giving short shrift to the stories that actually may be more important. The kind of dialogue, the Abrahamic dialogue that he's talking about that's going on here, or the efforts to bring people together, even in the West Bank and in Israel.
Part of what you're describing, though, is a sort of reporting on an event. Something blows up.
Right.
Versus something that's going to take generations, a dialogue that's going to change the way people think about each other and live together. It's not as easy to cover in a 30-minute or even...
Well, it's why people do books and longer articles. It's much more difficult to do in a quick newspaper or television.
Akbar, when you sit home and monitor whether CNN or MSNBC or any of the Fox News channel, what is your reaction in general? Is it worth watching from your perspective?
In general, John, my wife tells me I've got to be careful about my blood pressure, because it just seems to... You see, what I am very disappointed about is that you get 4 people discussing, say, Islam, and you'll not see a Muslim there. And you'll have 4 people, really, most of the discussions, rehearsing a kind of traditional prejudice, if you like, and feeding again into a stereotype of Islam. And this worries me, because there's a link between the media, between policy and implementation of policy. And I gave you the example of people being actually briefed by these so-called experts that led Americans to believe that they would be welcomed when they arrived in Basra. And that did not happen. So obviously, some heads should roll. I'm talking metaphorically, not literally. No heads rolled. The same heads are back now advising the Americans about other things, and they're going to get them equally wrong, because they're not understanding how Muslims work.
Where is the best coverage? I mean, other than the obvious, Joyce Davis's
Mike
work.
Ritter has the best coverage.
But other than Joyce, who is obviously, you've been working on this for a long time. You don't qualify as an instant expert, you're a true expert. But what about
I think C-SPAN, John, I would give you credit for the simple reason that you allow a platform. You're perhaps not aware of it, but you are playing a very important role now, so that people can simply judge for themselves. Let them hear, let them see, and make their own decisions. This is not happening in many of the channels that I see, where you have 4 people of the same view feeding into their own prejudices and not allowing any other point of view. And sometimes I just decline to appear on these, because I feel it's such a hopeless battle. Now, when you see the news here and you see it in Europe, the BBC, for instance, you get a slightly different picture. And then you move further east and you get a slightly different picture again. And what is so important, because America has the finest journalists, the finest media, is really for America to be able to present news that is reliable and credible. And I'm afraid over the last few months that has taken a...
Have you seen any evolution? I mean, in other words, has the coverage improved since the initial coverage post 9/11?
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I have to emphasize is that when I stepped into this field about 15 years ago, it was abysmal, the ignorance. And there not only were there no Muslims, I mean, you didn't even go to a Muslim source to talk about these issues, or an Arab source to talk about what was going on in the Middle East. That has changed dramatically. Now, despite, you know, all the chaos that is in the world, the fact is Americans know much more now about Islam, about that part of the world, about what the grievances are. They are much more interested, I have seen, in not just accepting the superficial, oh, they just hate us, but in now stepping back, delving into Well, let's look at the reasons and see if there's anything we may want to address, that we may not. But at least we want the truth and not just the fiction and the myths. This is a big improvement.
I think, John, I would very much agree with Joyce that we've reached a stage, it's almost a phase 2, if you like, in America, where people are getting over the shock of discovering that the 19 hijackers were all Muslim, and now beginning to ask, what is Islam all about? And so the books on Islam, for instance, Joyce's own excellent book, are now much more nuanced, they're much more sophisticated, they're asking questions, they're pointing directions, where do we go from here? And this is important.
It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out during a presidential election cycle.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Alexander Saris. I'm from Langley High School. I was just wondering that if it is true that the majority of Muslims living in majority of people living in Islamic countries do not support or condone suicide bombings or terrorist acts, then why isn't there more of a cry within those countries to end it and to stop it? I think that if the cheering in the streets after terrorist acts or bombings in Palestine or in Israel or in the United States were replaced with outrage, then maybe those frequency of those events happening would decline.
Sarah, before we get an answer to your question, I'm just curious, based on what we were just talking about, have you talked about different regions of the world in your classes, or Islam, or these issues in a more significant way than you had prior to 9/11?
Yes, we talk about in our government classes. We learned about different religions in our freshman world studies classes. We learned about Islam and the Quran. We had speakers. We all are very educated about the religion, and we know that violence is not preached in religion, but we also do see TV, and we do see what's happening, and we do see cheering in the streets after September 11th, when a lot of us, especially in this area, were affected by what happened. So I can tell you that personally I was angered to see them cheering and happy about the death and destruction that happened here.
Okay, get a reaction.
Well, again, this gets to Dr. Ahmed's point about how well the American media covers it. After that, I happened to do a story for Night Readers Papers that actually showed the condemnation that came from around the world from Muslim clerics saying that this was completely outside of the bounds of Islam. Somehow you didn't read that. Somehow the television stations didn't carry those clerics. There was outrage throughout the Muslim world over this. Yes, there was some cheering, small. In fact, they went back to show that even some of the footage that was carried was old footage from a former clash. So again, you really need to seek out alternative sources and seek out the people who are really trying to bring you the truth. In my own research, I have gone to people like Sheikh Yassin of Hamas, Hezbollah's leaders and all, and they all said September 11th was outside of the bounds of anything. But there is a discrepancy and a debate about suicide bombers and about whether their tactics are justified in given the conditions. Some say it's not justified, Islam forbids suicide. There are those, a small minority, who believe that it is justified against military targets, and a smaller percentage, very small, say all of Israel is a military target. So you see the gradations. But the fact is, the mainstream Muslims, and I am not a Muslim, I have no reason to give you a phony interpretation, the majority of moderate Muslims have said Islam does not condone or support these kinds of actions.
And what is important, Sarah, that you've got to understand that the information that you have may be one-sided, and that was the complaint I had earlier to John. Across the Muslim world, the highest authority in the Sunni world is the Sheikh al-Azhar in Cairo. The highest authority in Iran with the Shia Islamic sect are the Ayatollahs. They all unanimously condemned what happened. I was repeatedly in the media condemning what happened. The major institutions in America, the Muslim institutions, and we have some very distinguished Muslims present here today, they condemn this in black and white. Now, why didn't you hear about it? My question is to you, and you have to ask yourself that. Why didn't I hear about it? Because the whole Muslim world is saying one thing, but that voice is not reaching you. It's not reaching you because those four men discussing the issue are going to say, here we have these clips, Muslims are jumping up in joy. And as Joyce pointed out, there's a debate about those Muslim people jumping up in joy, and if they were, there's something wrong with them. There's something sick, because you don't rejoice in someone suffering. That is not Islam.
And to give you one other example, we would be we would just be appalled if a foreign crew had gone to the South and taken a picture of the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross and said that that's Christianity. But that's what I have come to know as one form of Christianity. But I know that that is not Christianity. However much they proclaim that they are protecting the white race and that this is what Jesus Christ would want, I know that that's not the case. The same is true of these militants in Islam.
In your book, Joyce, here you end with what you identify as a central question. The Muslim World League's delegation clearly addressed what might be the most crucial question for many Americans. It relates to your question, Sarah. Were the September 11th hijackers indeed martyrs for Islam? You go on to write, Muslim scholars overwhelmingly say no. Finally, the world's preeminent Muslim scholars have concluded that Muhammad Atta, bin Laden, and Zawahiri were neither innocents nor soldiers fighting under the strict precepts of Islamic law. They were terrorists, distorting their religion's true meanings, true teachings. Again, this is somewhat of an oversimplification, and I'm not attempting to alibi for mainstream media, but this is sort of the equivalent of the hockey game coverage, where 3 hours of sport and one fight that lasted 1 minute makes it onto the highlight reel. And similarly, a street scene in Baghdad, if somebody's burning an effigy of George W. Bush, that's going to make it onto the highlight reel, whether it represents the entire group or not. Hi.
I'm John McCormick from Langley High School. So just how big of an impact do you think the media has had on the severity of the situation of the forming of biased opinions? And do you think it has in any way missed an opportunity to help alleviate some of the tension?
Are you asking about even in the U.S. response? Has media coverage played a role in support for war or any other type of?
Yes, basically since the 9/11, its choice in scrutinizing the situation. Do you think it has? How big of an impact do you think it has had?
Do you have a theory?
Probably that it's had a negative effect all over the world because in its choices and what to show and what not to show to the public.
Yes, the media has a great impact. Don't forget that American media is seen and heard and read in the Muslim world as across the world. Now, when the American media is constantly reporting one aspect of the relationship between America and the Muslim world, that is being magnified in the Muslim world. For example, the attack on the Prophet. Now, the Prophet of Islam was abused and called a terrorist and all kinds of names. This was highlighted in the media. And when you're not highlighting the interfaith and the what Joyce is talking about, the goodwill that also exists, when you don't do that, you're just projecting one very negative aspect of the relationship. The impact in the Muslim world is that it feeds into the sense of being under siege, and therefore the so-called extremists, the so-called fanatics, the so-called people who would want violence, they are supported. They gather strength. And very often that feeds into local politics. I'll give you my example from Pakistan, where the religious parties never got more than 4 or 5 seats in parliament. This time, a few months ago when the elections took place, the religious leaders stood for the elections and said, we will protect Islam against the Americans. Vote for us, we will fight for you against America, because the Prophet is being attacked, Islam is being attacked. And this time they got 10 times the number. 10 times the number, and they got 2 provinces which lie along the borders between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And today, this is the point I want to make, today the Americans in eastern Afghanistan, American troops, American institutions are under attack. People are being sniped at, shot at, and there are regular fire exchanges. So we've got to try to link up the media and the real world out there. We've got to try to connect the dots. This is my job as a scholar. The media must be aware of the great responsibility it has today in this particular relationship between America and the Muslim world. And I don't think they're fully aware of it.
Al Jazeera has certainly been a point of much discussion. Is the influence and impact of media coverage similar in the Islamic world as it is in the United States?
Well, Al Jazeera and even stations like Al Manara out of Lebanon are really a sensation in the Arab world. It is allowing them to have coverage that they believe is more attuned to their interest and
is
to
the influence of, is it roughly equivalent if you're trying to gauge the question that you ask about how much impact media coverage has in the way people think, and then eventually the public policy that follows?
I think, well, public policy and government, that's different. No, it probably doesn't have as much impact on what actually governments do, but on people's thinking, yes, it's profound in public opinion.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Humayra Nuristani, and I'm a student at American University. Dr. Ahmed, in your class we learned about distinguished scholars such as Huntington and Lewis. They discuss a clash of civilizations. So how, in light of the sentiment, can we engage for a dialogue of civilizations? How can it take place?
Well, Humaira, first of all, I'm delighted you're wearing your Afghan dress and reflecting the rich cultural tradition of your country.
You mean all students at AU don't dress like that?
You think we're all high on marijuana, something we come wearing a colorful dress? Humaira, that's a very important question because we have to constantly try to understand the world in which we are living. So you have the idea of the clash, which is very powerful. It's universal, it's being picked up, and it's being used by, I'm sorry to say, the extremists in the Muslim world. Because they are picking this up and saying the West is on a war path against Islam. So therefore, the steps that we have to take, I mean, these are tiny steps, these may not succeed in the end, but we have to take them, are the steps for interfaith dialogue. And I've given the example of Bishop John, I've given the example of the rabbi, and I'm delighted that Joyce is hosting a session with these people at the National Press Club. So the idea of dialogue becomes very important. Also, I would say, Humaira, the development of personal relationships. This is very important. So you have governments and you have institutions, but you must also have personal relationships. This book, Islam Under Siege, for instance, is dedicated to Professor Lawrence Rosen at Princeton University. Now, he's not a Muslim. He's in fact Jewish. He's an anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist. We are old friends for the last 2 decades. And for me, he's a great scholar and a great friend. And my wife, Zeenat, and I decided that we would dedicate it to Larry. So here you have, again, a small bridge between different civilizations. And that is what has to be done. So that in spite of this post-honor world into which we are moving, you still have human relationships, human friendships that ultimately trump the hatred and the violence.
And despite the fears that clearly many Americans have about Islam and about Muslims, there is, I have not known in any previous time, more interest, more of a thirst to really understand, and that is a very positive sign.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi, my name is Nadia Siddiqui, and I'm a senior at Langley High School. And my question was, you've been talking about building bridges of communication, and my concern was over the Muslim youth in America and how we can build a bridge to the non-Muslim youth and how we can communicate to them because they're being bombarded with media that's just emphasizing stuff that's not right about Islam and Muslims in America, not in America. So what can we do to just promote rightful teaching of our faith?
That's a very good question because you point out the non-Muslim and Muslim youth, the need for dialogue there, but also the need for dialogue between the Muslim elder generation and the young generation. There's also, I believe, a crisis within that relationship because, you know, you're really living in a very different culture, different society from your parents' generation who came from different countries, maybe India or Pakistan. Where are you from?
I'm half Indian, half Pakistani.
So there you are, you represent South Asia.
Yeah.
So you've come here and now you are growing as an American. You are in fact American. So you have a problem in terms of your relationship with your parents and their cultures because I know them, I come from that part of the world. They bring their cultures here and they simply want to hold on to them, which is a good thing. Immigrants must retain their own identity and culture and so on. At the same time, they have to also live as Americans. They must appreciate, absorb what is the best in this culture, and this is what makes America so great. What suggestion do you have for this?
Now that you represent 2 regions of the world.
Well, between youth or between parental?
You and non-Muslims.
Oh, well, I'm president of the MSA at my school, so just by having a lot of events where we have speakers.
What's MSA stand for?
Muslim Student Association, I'm sorry. And just having events where we can have speakers come to our school. We had last year in the spring, the freshman class was learning about Islam, so we had an invitational assembly at our school just to have speakers come in and talk about women and hijab and like just stuff like that. And it's also our role in playing dawah, like we have to represent Islam. So we just do little things like that, but sometimes the media just they get confused and it's hard. So I wish we had some other means of like.
Well, you have to help the media. This is the whole discussion, that you have to help them. For them also, it's a learning.
We need your
Yeah.
help.
But also,
learning experience for them.
Also, I was going to say, your Abrahamic dialogue, that should be a traveling roadshow. It should be going around to schools and having these kinds of discussions all over the country.
Well, Joyce, Bruce Feiler, when he introduced the session yesterday at the clergy conference, did start by saying the rabbi, the bishop, Ahmed and myself, and he said, it sounds like a bad joke.
It's the...
So don't make a joke out of it, Joyce.
No, but I think you should travel, yes.
The Dialogues of Civilization Vaudeville Act. Thank you very much. Hi.
Hello, I'm Sally Rush, and I'm the former vice chairman of the International Correspondence Committee at the National Press Club. And to better understand Islam, can you address specifically some of the tenets or precepts of Islam, even the definitions in Islam that have been distorted from the Western perspective? Secondly, I would like for you to address the commonalities between the three great monotheistic religions in the Abrahamic tradition. And thirdly, I would like to know how the word is being spread.
And if I can rain on your parade, we have about 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes left in the program for you to do that. So the history of Islam and everything that it means in 2 minutes.
Read my book.
I'll just say one thing that I have known, the jihad, the issue of jihad. Many people who are non-Muslims do not know that the greater jihad, inner jihad, is the control of your own self, the discipline. And they do not know that Islam sets very strict guidelines for war, which do not include killing women and children or the defenseless, the weak. And if you read that and study that, you will understand why what is happening is so outside of the bounds of Islam.
And we can focus on at least a part of your question, Joyce did, but what about the last part of how is the word being spread?
How is the word being spread? What is being done to increase dialogue?
I think the word is being spread precisely in platforms like this, where people, and I know millions of people, will see this, hear this, and begin to understand that it is a much more complicated subject that we are discussing. And I have a great deal of faith in the American public, in the American people. They're an open-minded people, and I think that they're getting over this first initial understandable shock from September 11, and beginning to understand and even appreciate what they're dealing with, that is the world of Islam.
Thanks. We're just about out of time, but I want to end on a hopeful note, and that is, I can ask both of you, leadership. You addressed this in one of your chapters, a failure of Muslim leadership. We've seen leaders like Osama bin Laden. Where can we look as we move forward in phase 2, as you call it here in the United States? As the world moves forward, where should we look for leadership? Can you give us some names of some people we should keep our eyes on? And only have, unfortunately, about 20 seconds for each of you to do that.
Well, Dr. Ahmed is one of them. He's clearly one of the people who, and what is so good about what he's doing is that he is not only talking to the outer world, he is talking to the inner world of Islam. And one of the things that's good about that is that he is calling forth that if indeed this is a religion of peace and of tolerance and of beauty and of love, that has to come to the fore. And this battle has to be fought within and among Muslims. And he is one of the people that's leading that.
That's, all flattery aside, and I know you mean this sincerely, how do you feel about that, being given that challenge?
Well, it's such a huge compliment, John, from
huge
Joyce,
job.
who I admire so much. But at this moment in time, John, it is more than just an individual. I do see this as a great challenge. It's going to be a great challenge for the 21st century, not only for Muslims, because what happens in the Muslim world will have an impact on the West. And therefore, it's in all our joint interest, mutual interest, to begin to understand the Muslim world and help the Muslim world to find, as Joyce said very correctly, its own sense of balance, its sense of honor, sense of dignity. And you don't do that by this constant abuse of the Prophet or of Islam. So we really have to begin to think slightly differently about these issues.
Well, I can honestly say that having known both of you in a couple of years, I always learn something new when I spend some time either reading your work or talking to you. So thank you for joining us today. And these are the books. Islam Under Siege is Akbar Ahmed's newest book. And from Joyce Davis, Martyrs. And these are available in bookstores now, and I can tell you, the red eyes prove I read them both last night, and they are very provocative and interesting books. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to all of you, our guests from around the D.C. area, and also our special guest from Langley High School. I want to make a special thanks to your teacher, Mary Kortanek, Close-Up's best friends in this world, our teachers. So thanks for all of your work with your students and coming here today. Next week, we return to the museum for another discussion. Hope you'll join us then. Until then, for all of us at the Freedom Forum Museum and Close-Up Foundation, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for watching.
Now a program update. Next.